it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jesse Richmond. He is currently at Old Dominion University, and he received his PhD and his master's from Carnegie, isn't it Carnegie Mellon, and his undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh. He is from the Pittsburgh area originally. He's married and has 5 children. He is currently an associate professor in political science and geography at Old Dominion University. He's published articles in a number of journals, including the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, Legislative Studies Quarterly, Electoral Studies and State Politics, and Policy Quarterly. A couple of the titles were Climate Change Skepticism in the Flood Zone, Risk and Risk Perception Among Virginia Coastal Residents, which is very pertinent after what we all just went through in the last few days, and Parties, Pivots, and Policy. See, that's why I asked him for title examples. I think this is one of his fortes, is bringing out a good title. The Status Quo Test of Uncertainty and the Prevalence of Committee Outliers. He is married and has 5 children, and this is going to be an unbiased overview of the whole political situation. Do not count on him to tell you who to vote for. This is to give you sort of an overview of what's going on, how things are, and then he'll be available for questions after the talk. Dr. Richmond.
Thank you. So the title I picked for this talk was American Politics at the Crossroads, Parties, Politics, and Change. We're in the midst of drawing towards the end of what has been alternately a fascinating, deeply distressing, and potentially very momentous electoral campaign for president, and I certainly want to talk about that. I want to go in several directions today, thinking about various big questions. And I'm sorry if this black on gray isn't showing up well. Most of my slides won't have that theme. Big kinds of questions, and again, and I'm open to your questions too, where you want to direct this as we think together about American politics and where it's at and where it's going. We're at a moment in which the parties and their and the public are at some kind of crossroads. This is a graph of some polling data looking at public perceptions of the direction of the country. So this is a question asked by NBC Wall Street Journal poll. All in all, do you think things in the nation are generally headed in the right direction, or do you feel that things are off on the wrong track? And the blue line here is right direction, red line is wrong track. And you can see starting in about 2003, invasion of Iraq, that territory, we see wrong direction exceeding right direction. They really pull far apart by the time you have the economic collapse and the 2008 election of Barack Obama, pulled together briefly in a moment of unity here after Obama's election, perhaps, and then rapidly wrong direction goes back far ahead of right direction. And that's not the only kind of general sense of dissatisfaction you can see in the country today. I want to talk first about the parties and the partisan warfare that characterizes our politics today. And I'm sorry, am I moving too much for the? So this shows the portion of people with a favorable opinion of the Democratic Party in the blue line, the Republican Party in the red line. You can see there's been some variation. Sometimes they move together. Sometimes one party's up and the other party's down. But the general trend is of, over the last decade and a half, a kind of downward movement. The parties at one point were sort of bouncing around the 50% line. Now they're bouncing around the 40% line. And the Republican Party in particular has spent some time below 30% on occasion, but mostly in the 35 to 40, Democrat 40 to 35. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the parties. A lot of people, with an unfavorable view of one or both parties, who look at the current campaign and then speculate a little bit about where we're going. But all of this is subject to change. Feel free to jump in with questions at any point. I'm happy to redirect in whatever direction you find interesting. If there's a burning topic you want to bring to this, please do go right ahead. So to start by thinking about parties and partisanship. And here I think there's a kind of apology that political scientists as a discipline owe the country. Back in the 40s and early 50s, there was an argument by some political scientist, E. Schattschneider, headed a group with the American Political Science Association, wrote a report on the political parties. Their argument was the parties just aren't different enough. They are too similar. There's not enough of a choice offer. And so Schattschneider articulated this idea of responsible party government. This requires that we have well-disciplined parties. They hold clearly divergent views, so people have a real choice. They get elected. If the party gets elected, they then enact their program, and then they get held responsible for that. It's a vision that's sort of imported from the British parliamentary system. The challenge is how that works when you put it in conjunction with the American separation of powers system, and it sometimes doesn't work particularly well. This is a graph looking at the percentage of the time that the two parties in Congress, majority of one party votes against a majority of the other party. And you can see the basic pattern. Schattschneider was writing at a point of particularly low partisanship in this sort of mid-century low point in partisanship, and that's since picked up back toward more what the historic levels were in the 19th century. Measurement may be a little bit more suspect here, but this is an effort by political scientists to put the political parties on some kind of ideological dimension. How far apart are Republicans, that's the blue line here, from Democrats? That's this dark line in the middle. Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats, the two different lines there. And what we see in Congress, again, is a kind of pulling apart of the parties. Not so far apart here. A lot of votes that had some Republicans joining with some Democrats to try to pass policy. And today that's much less common. We have many more votes where that isn't occurring. And there are many issues in which the parties have major disagreements. And getting things done becomes harder. Similar patterns, but a lot of variation in state legislatures. Here, just a few state legislatures. This is a shorter time series. We don't have as much data in state legislatures. You can see some states there's a real pulling apart. Texas, Republican and Democratic parties pulling apart. Other states, they're relatively close together. Rhode Island, there's not much movement and they're very near each other. Virginia, we have a pretty typical amount of polarization between the parties in our state legislature as well. So the parties are very different. Which on the one hand, if you think about Schattschneider's standard, we have a clear choice. And in this presidential election, right, there is a really clear choice across lots of policy issues, almost all policy issues. There's a sharp contrast between what package of positions, what issues you get if you vote for Donald Trump versus if you vote for Hillary Clinton. Right? So there is very much a clear choice. And that's arguably very much to the good. On the other hand, the challenge that maybe Schattschneider and the others didn't emphasize enough is the way this often creates problems for policy making. So what happens when we take parties with very different positions who are always campaigning to try to gain advantage in elections, and we put them in the system of separated institutions sharing powers? But you know who these three individuals are, right? So Speaker of the House, Majority Leader in the Senate, Minority Leader in the Senate. All three of these individuals have substantial power in the current Congress to prevent policy change. And they're not always going to agree with each other about what that policy looks like. And their caucuses, their party supporters in each chamber also are often unlikely to agree with each other. The Constitution sets up some of the barriers to action. Others we've created over time. So the Constitution, to change a law, you need House and Senate majorities plus the president, or House and Senate supermajorities sufficient to override a presidential veto. And we just recently saw the first override of a veto by President Obama, a piece of legislation to enable victims of the 9/11 attacks to sue Saudi Arabia, among other things. Obama thought that was a bad foreign policy decision. Majorities in the House and Senate thought it looked like a popular vote, and then started to wonder if maybe they ought to amend the law after the election, because maybe it wasn't a good idea after all. But we had the House and Senate supermajorities there, 2/3 overturning. But the Constitution doesn't just set up that. The Constitution sets up that barrier, but that's not the only barrier we have currently. There's a rise of the filibuster. This allows, under the current operation of this rule, a minority of senators, 40 senators, to block most kinds of policy change in Congress. This is a relatively new development. The filibuster, through the early 1970s, operated in a relatively different way. Here's a graph showing the number of cloture votes. These are votes to end filibusters in the Senate. And you can see from the creation of the cloture motion through to about 1970, this is used extremely rarely. The cloture tool was leveraged almost not at all. And then there's a sharp shift in the degree to which this is used. Right? We go up. Today, most major legislation faces a string of cloture votes. There are multiple places in which a bill can be filibustered. Senators don't actually have to stand up and filibuster. It's been institutionalized to the point where you simply threaten to filibuster, then they hold a cloture vote. If they don't have the votes to overcome cloture, then the bill goes away and dies until maybe the leaders bring it back for another effort at cloture. And so, why did that happen? Subtle aspects of institutions matter in understanding how politics works. I think one of the changes was they made it easier to invoke cloture here. The majority dropped from 2/3 to 3/5. So it's a few fewer senators. That's part of the story, but it's not the most important. The key thing is, although they dropped the margin, they changed the requirement. Previously, it was 2/3 of senators present and voting. So what did this mean? You could have a real showdown, right? There's a minority that wants to block change. What do? You, as a majority, wear them down, right? There could be a cloture vote any time. They've got to have their members, and many of these members don't really like being up in the middle of the night. They have to be ready to get to the Senate floor whenever that vote might happen. The rule changed. Now it's 3/5 of all senators. What does that mean? If you don't have 60 senators in favor of cloture, there's absolutely nothing you can do. The minority can sleep soundly in their beds knowing that even if none of them show up when a cloture vote happens, so long as there are not 60 senators voting for cloture, the motion will fail. That's very important, I think, in understanding how the filibuster metastasized into something that doesn't merely provide a check for passionate minorities who really care a lot about an issue versus majorities who don't, into something where even if the minority cares very little, it's costless for them to block a majority that cares a great deal about an issue. And I think that's problematic in terms of how this operates. Another change that's happened involves the evolution of House institutions. The House of Representatives as a majority party which has a great deal of power in setting the agenda. Over the last several decades, the majority party has drawn more power to itself in terms of shaping the agenda. The last time it was as powerful as it has become was around the turn of the 20th century, before there was a revolt among progressive Republicans that stripped the Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, of a number of his crucial powers. One of the ways in which speakers and party leaders have used this power is to block passage of legislation that is opposed by a majority of their majority. So you might have, if you have a narrow majority, this might mean you have little over 1/4 of the House of Representatives opposed to a piece of legislation. But because that slightly over 1/4 is in the majority party, it's not going to go anywhere. Exacerbated by fights where the minority party is unwilling to lend the majority party support on various compromises. This is a graph showing the frequency of Hastert Rule violations on final passage according to the New York Times count. You can see there are a couple of times in most Congresses, one or two, in which a majority of the majority party doesn't favor legislation that passes the House. But it's exceedingly rare. Most of the time, if a majority of the majority party doesn't want something to pass, it won't pass. And so even if large majorities in Congress want something, there's no guarantee that will happen. Either the filibuster may block it, or the Hastert Rule may block it. And so what's the consequence of this? One of the consequences is gridlock. So this is a measure of the size of the interval that the filibuster creates and the presidential veto creates, within which it's very difficult to change policy, because maybe the president wants to move policy one way, but the House wants to move it another way. Or the president wants to move it one way, and the House wants to move it one way, and the majority of the Senate want to move it one way, but you don't have 60 votes in the Senate to overcome filibuster, right? So generally, as the parties have become more polarized, the size of this gridlock interval has increased. There are some exceptions to a degree, and these are instances in which you have unified control over the Senate, the House, the presidency, and a big enough margin in the Senate that filibusters can be overcome. Will that happen in this election? Very unlikely. Most likely, no matter who wins, the other party will have at least the Senate filibuster with which to frustrate the efforts of whoever is president and prevent most policy change from happening. Even if Democrats win a House majority, which was seen as very unlikely until perhaps this weekend, even if we have the Democrats win control of the Senate, the odds of winning a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate are quite low, and that's what it would take for an administration to be able to really move policy forward. Another consequence is a decline in legislative productivity. As polarization has increased over the last half century or so, the number of laws passed in each Congress has gradually diminished. And so we're getting fewer and fewer pieces of legislation coming out of Congress. There are multiple causes to this. It's not just polarization, it's also internal changes in Congress, which have prioritized member staffs over committee staffs, for instance. The committees are the heart of the legislative enterprise in Congress. They're the places that develop expertise, that really have the skills, the depth to craft important legislation. Over time, what's happened is the committee staffs have flatlined and been cut. Member personal office staffs have increased, which is good for individual members looking to have more people to put out press releases and help them get reelected. But ultimately, it doesn't do very much for policy, because most member staffs are still too small and too spread out to really be able to work effectively to craft a lot of major legislation, especially in the House side, where staffs are still relatively small. You have a total of 18 people, but only about 3 or 4 often are really working on policy. The rest are working on writing to constituents and doing the press stuff and so forth. So in thinking about sort of this act one of my talk, talking about the polarization of the parties, what we've seen is clear choices, but it's not clear those choices connect very clearly to consequences in many cases, because the separation of power system really is designed to force compromise. And as the parties have polarized and as partisan conflict has become ever more bitter, it's become harder to achieve compromise as both parties maneuver for electoral advantage. When I was a congressional fellow a few years ago at the American Political Science Association, there were various instances I saw that just highlighted the degree of polarization, where another congressional fellow of the same program was working for committee staff on the other side of the partisan divide. And he was concerned about being seen talking with me in the hallway because he was afraid that then he would be perceived as a potential traitor, a risk to his side's partisan positioning. Totally nonpartisan issue, helium. The U.S. has been gradually selling off an enormous helium reserve. Reauthorization legislation needed. Members concerned about, well, yeah, so it's totally nonpartisan issue. There's somebody far left, far right, you could work together. But we don't want to do that because it's not going to look good if we're working together with somebody too far to the other side. So that's sort of the background to the current campaign. Let's talk about the current campaign. I apologize, these slides are badly out of date. They were put together on Thursday of last week. And we don't have a lot of polling out since the Trump video came out on Friday, but what little bit we have suggests that this gap just doubled. Whether that holds, I don't know. Very early, not very many polls, small samples, but it appears that the gap between Trump and Clinton has opened significantly in the wake of this tape where Trump was boasting about his sexual assaults that he now says he never actually did. He merely boasted about them, but still I think it's really hurt him politically, at least in the short term. This effect may fade, but Clinton's been ahead most of the time, and I think this widens Clinton's lead. Betting odds also have widened since then, so they're now more like that. But on the whole, even before this, Trump was in some difficulties. The prediction, Trump was given about a 25% chance. Now it's dropped below 20. Nate Silver, the website 538, does a lot of modeling of election outcomes. This was his map. Again, this is prior to the Friday tape really influencing the model. But what Silver was predicting was a significant Clinton victory. A divided electorate, Clinton not quite getting to a majority, but Trump at 43, Johnson at 6.9, and the odds of a Trump victory at about 20%. Now, something that's become particularly important, arguably, recently is the question of what happens in the Senate and the House. The Senate fight was looking very even, a narrow advantage to Democrats in the overall Senate struggle. And I think this partly reflects the structural disadvantages Republicans faced this cycle. 2016 is 6 years after 2010. That was the time when all of the senators currently up for re-election won their seats. 2010 was a fabulous year for Republicans. They didn't manage to take the Senate that year, but they did very, very well, including in quite a few states that Democrats ordinarily do quite well in. And so it was a very tough set of seats for Republicans in the Senate to hold. Many more Republican incumbents vulnerable than Democratic incumbents. And that's only being complicated by the issues with Trump. Currently, 1/3 of sitting Republican senators have refused to endorse Donald Trump or withdrawn their endorsements. That's almost unprecedented in terms of the scale of sitting senators for a major party refusing to endorse their party's nominee for president. And it reflects in part the enormous difficulties faced by the Trump campaign going forward as a result of the kinds of things that their candidate has said. The House of Representatives is an interesting case. The predictions have been, and again this is prior to effects from the weekend, that Republicans would almost surely retain control. The Republicans have a very large majority in the House, historically large. They haven't had this large a majority in many, many years. And the expectation was they would be able to retain that majority, lose a few seats perhaps, but not many. Lost a seat because of redistricting in Virginia, for example, with the redraw of the 4th congressional district and Randy Forbes' decision not to even try to run for re-election there, but to try to move to the 2nd district where he lost the primary. But the 2nd district is probably safer now for Republicans than it was because it gained some Republicans from the old 4th district. And the House as a whole is likely to stay Republican. That's getting a little bit dicier if Trump loses really big, which is more likely a possibility now than it was a few days ago. That could lead to a defeat of the Republican majority in the House of Representatives, which has been there now for 6 years. All in all, it's been an odd election cycle. This graph from Real Clear Politics shows the favorable, unfavorable ratings for Trump and Clinton. Notice the top of this graph is at -5. We have two candidates who are both unpopular, who more people view unfavorably than favorably. And Clinton's advantage is that not quite as many people dislike her as dislike Trump, but these are both historically unpopular candidates compared to what we normally see. And that reflects in part the tremendous negative campaigning that's taken place in this election cycle and the real focus on tearing down the opponent as opposed to building up the campaign and the views of your side. But it represents a real challenge, I think, going forward for whoever wins the presidency, because whoever wins will have won despite more people having an unfavorable view than a favorable view. You'll start from a pretty weak position, which will make it harder to accumulate the kind of loyalty, the sort of first 100 days, let's get stuff done, that kind of atmosphere will be harder simply because of the unpopularity of whoever wins. So let's think about futures a little bit and speculate about that to some extent. And then let's go to questions and take this wherever you think it would be interesting to go. I think one of the interesting questions to think about is how this election may change our politics. It's one of the, in some ways it reflects our current politics. We've seen extraordinarily bitter and nasty language in the debates. Interpersonal rudeness, even somebody like Tim Kaine, a senator of Virginia, who in most instances is relatively polite and mild-mannered. The Clinton campaign, for whatever reason, decided his role was to be a attack dog. He executed very poorly because that's not who he is, but that's where he went in the vice presidential debate. Lots of interruption, lots of denigrating the opponent in very personal ways. depending on your partisan side, you may or may not believe that particular denigrations are well-deserved. But I think it reflects as well where and what the tone of our politics is, that we have a major party candidate, for instance, in the last debate, saying that the other candidate was the devil, saying that the other candidate deserved to be put in jail. These kinds of comments are troubling concerning our politics, because they tend to delegitimize the opponent if the opponent wins. And that only makes more likely a continuation of the sort of partisan rancor we've seen for the last couple of presidential administrations, in which the other party primarily works to prevent the party with the White House from accomplishing many of their political goals. Now, in thinking about how the parties are changing, one interpretation of what Trump represents is a kind of nationalist wave that's happening in various parts of the world. So we see the rejection of European Union membership in the Brexit, so-called Brexit vote in Britain earlier in the summer, voting to exit from this international organization that's kind of moving towards some kind of federal or confederal union in Europe. The British voters decided they wanted none of that on the strength of issues like immigration, on wanting to put up barriers. Politicians like Marine Le Pen of the Front National in France, polling fairly well, likely to get into the second round of the French presidential election, where she's likely to lose, but in Eastern Europe we see a number of conservative, nationalist governments of various types seizing power in Hungary, Poland, and so forth. There's a shift that Trump is part of that's happening in various parts of the world, a kind of anti-globalization, anti-immigration. Let's put up walls and barriers. And that there are a variety of underlying issues that are feeding into this, including the real struggles of parts of the working class, the decline of manufacturing and industry in the U.S. and in Western Europe, issues like the trade deficit with China. We're spending about $1 billion a day more on goods and services from China than we're selling to China. And we're borrowing the difference or making it up trading elsewhere. These are the kinds of things that have fueled that insurgency. On the other hand, we have a lot of discontent on parts of the left, too. Hillary Clinton narrowly won the Democratic primaries, which were supposed to be much easier for her to win, in the face of a kind of socialist progressive challenge by Sanders. We have the Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy movement, other kinds of concerns on the left about the current consensus around globalization and capitalism and so forth. Hillary Clinton has made some feints in that direction, but that pressure is going to still be there in the Democratic Party, and didn't succeed in capturing the top of the ticket this time, but will still be around 4 years from now, 8 years from now, and in the Democratic caucus in Congress. And there are major challenges that are likely to go unaddressed no matter who wins, including our indebtedness. On the Republican side, the tendency is to see tax cuts as a magic elixir that's appropriate in all circumstances. If the economy is doing badly, we need tax cuts to get it moving. If the economy is doing well and the deficit has has shrunk a little bit, we need some tax cuts to help get money back to the people who deserve it, the taxpayers. On the Democratic side, there's a tendency to see spending as always a good idea. If the economy is going slowly, we need to increase spending as a kind of Keynesian stimulus. If the economy is doing well and there's more money in the budget, well, we have a lot of things we need to invest in. All well and good, except that the tendency over the last several decades has been to more or less ignore the issue of how to pay for this, And as a result, we're nearing historic levels of indebtedness. This graph's a little bit misleading. This is not inflation adjusted. One way to adjust the graph in terms of thinking about our capacity to pay for the debt is to think about debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. And so you can see our debt in the early 90s when Clinton and House Democrats and then Clinton and House Republicans made a series of deals to rein in spending and increase taxes. It was at about 60% of GDP. They brought it down to about 55% of GDP, and it has since climbed to over 100% of GDP, which we haven't seen before in the last 100 years, except in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Currently, it's relatively easy to service this debt. Interest rates are extremely low. We were paying about 3% of GDP to service the debt here. We are currently paying a little over 1% of GDP to service the debt currently. That's because interest rates are much lower. We have about twice the debt as a fraction of GDP, but we're paying only a little more than a third as much. If interest rates increase at some point, this could become a major challenge, though. If we end up paying interest rates like we were paying in 1990 on the size debt we have currently, we'd be looking at about 6% of GDP going for debt service. That's, to put that in some perspective, that's about a third of total tax receipts. That's about twice what we're currently spending on the military. That's enough to create enormous additional pressure on the federal budget. And so I think that's a long-term challenge, which unfortunately this campaign certainly hasn't seen any signs of addressing. We have neither candidate talking much about the debt. Trump's tax plan, most projections suggest, will increase the debt by about $5.5 trillion. Clinton has some plans to increase taxes, but many more plans to increase spending, and just rolled out plans to cut taxes. I think taxes are currently misaligned with our spending levels. We need to think about how to readjust the tax code to make it more efficient, but also to bring in more revenue. As was mentioned in the introduction, I have 5 children, which means I get generous child tax credits. As a result, I pay next to nothing in federal income tax. Is that appropriate? I don't think it is. I think I ought to be required to pay more in taxes than I'm currently required to pay. I think taxes are too low for the kinds of things we expect our government to do, particularly because we now also have to service this enormous debt, which we have rang up through our profligacy over the last several decades. And the longer we delay that, I think the more challenges we have. But I don't see either party effectively addressing that. So let's turn now to open discussion. I've thrown out various issues, talked a little bit about where the election currently stands, American politics. Where would you like to go? What questions, ideas, issues? Yes?
It bothers me that someone who takes a loss of almost $1 billion pays no federal tax.
It's another example of the way the current tax system really is functioning badly. The corporate tax system, too, is really needs some work. We have many large multinational corporations have figured out ways to shift their profits to tax shelters where they pay almost nothing in taxes. A small startup company operating purely in the United States will not have those kinds of opportunities, and so effectively they're competing against virtually untaxed competitors while paying a 35% tax rate on their profits. How are you going to get ahead in that context? I don't think it's very feasible. And so there are a lot of problems with the current tax system. Now, Trump did have enormous losses. He made a lot of bad investments in the 1980s, which by the 1990s were going broke. Trump Airline, some of his casino investments in Atlantic City went south almost immediately. and dragged the rest of his casino investments down with them. And so Trump did have big losses. He made a series of bad business decisions that caused enormous losses. And so he did have losses to write off, I think, but it reflects there's a question of to what extent and how do we want to have the tax code structured. Is it really optimal for someone who claims to be as rich as Trump to be able to avoid paying any income tax for such a long period of time as he seems to have been able to do? Yeah. Yes?
Everybody else probably knows what this is, but could you just briefly explain once more the Hastert Rule?
Okay, yes. So the Hastert Rule is a concept that was formalized in a speech by Dennis Hastert, the then Speaker of the House of Representatives, now in jail for child molestation, back in the early 2000s. Hastert formalized this rule. He said, the job of the Speaker is not to advance legislation which is opposed by a majority of the majority party. And so if a majority of your party, so let's imagine we've got a division in the Republican caucus currently between sort of Tea Party members and more kind of business conservative, Romney, Ryan kinds of Republicans. If you're governing under majority rule, if you don't have your caucus relatively united, you're not going to bring legislation up. And so you can see the few times when Speaker Boehner violated this rule, and I think it ultimately came back to bite him as he was forced out as Speaker, things like the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. This was supported by most Democrats, supported by a substantial minority of the Republican Party, more moderate Republicans, opposed by further right Republicans. And so the challenge, if you're applying the majority rule, you won't let that through. Why? Because the majority of the majority party doesn't want it, even though a solid majority in the chamber as a whole wants it. And so it was blocked for a while. Ultimately, Boehner decided that that the better interests of the party were to let this thing through because it was fueling and providing evidence for Democrats' argument that Republicans were engaged in a war on women. And so he ultimately let that piece of legislation reach the floor. But most of the time, and unless it's very high profile and very electorally dangerous or must pass, the government will shut down or default on the debt. Anything that's opposed by a large number of members of the majority party will not reach the floor of the House, even if it is broadly popular and would pass the chamber if brought to a vote.
I'm glad I asked.
After the last couple of debates, which I had to turn off, I mean, it was just, I couldn't take it. Do you think it's wise for us to perhaps go to each of the party platforms and actually read what is allegedly their platform at this point in time to find out exactly what the issues are? Because they don't seem to be discussed during the debates.
Okay, so the question was about whether issues are being discussed in the debates that are relevant for the choices voters need to make. And you suggested maybe we should look at the party platforms. Party platforms do provide an important resource in terms of what the parties want. However, the platforms don't always align perfectly with the preferences of the presidential candidates. And so there are points of slippage between the platform and the candidate. I think that the debates have spent a lot of time on things that aren't policy issues. And so that diminishes their capacity to inform people about policy substance. Even when talking about policy, the debate only provides a very, very thin, compressed discussion of policy. And so you get some sense of where they stand, but it's limited, and if you can stomach it, reading the party platforms could be a good idea. That said, I think there are clear substantive disagreements between the candidates that even did emerge in the debates on a range of issues, from trade policy, where Trump is clearly more protectionist than Clinton, to tax policy, where there's some big differences in their plans, to abortion, to what kinds of justices will be appointed to the Supreme Court by each candidate. I think you can see across a range of issues, and there are a few issues in which Trump has taken stances that are somewhat at odds with where the Republican Party has been historically. Immigration, he's taken a harder line, and on trade, he's really switched from the traditional Republican position of being more pro-free trade than the Democrats to an effort to really stake out a position as a candidate who is more stridently in favor of a change in the U.S. International trade posture. But on most other issues, Trump has more or less stayed with traditional Republican positions. And Clinton, similarly, on most issues, has stayed pretty much with conventional Democratic positions. So one of the advantages of the polarization we experience currently is that if you know much about the parties, you probably have a pretty good sense of where the candidates are going to stand on most issues, because for the most part they're staying with their party's orthodox stances. Yeah. First,
the question that I asked is that when you talk about the Constitution and how it affects sometimes the issues, one of the things that didn't come up and often doesn't get clear is the one on the Second Amendment that Trump talked a little bit about.
yes.
He really wants to get rid of it. And somehow some things seem not as current as they should be. I worry about the Second Amendment because I'm often more concerned about the fact of what meant at the time that it came about and what it's being used for at this particular time.
So the role of the Second Amendment in our current debate in the campaign. So, and you mentioned, well, what does the Second Amendment mean and what did it mean?
Yeah,
the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being important for crucial for I can't remember the exact term, security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And for a long time, the interpretation of the Second Amendment was that this was a kind of collective right to bear arms, maybe more relevant for state militias than for citizens not part of some state organization. The Supreme Court, in a series of crucial cases, DC versus Heller, began this process, reinterpreted the Second Amendment a few years ago, finding in the Second Amendment an explicit individual right to keep and bear arms, overturning the bans on handgun possession that the District of Columbia and Chicago, among other cities, had prior to this point had as violations of Second Amendment rights. The current political fight, as far as I can tell, is being waged over issues of the prudential regulations that are perhaps implied by the text of the Second Amendment, right? A well-regulated militia. What counts as well-regulated? What kinds of regulations can states put in place? To what extent background checks, internet purchases, other kinds of issues? To what extent should we restrict those? Clinton is in favor of more background check. Even some Republicans at various points have come out in favor of these, sometimes taking heat Scott Ridgell, retiring 2nd Congressional District member of Congress, took some heat from the right when he came out in favor of expanding some kinds of background checks. There's been a fight in Congress, still unresolved. They haven't passed anything because different sides have different versions, and it's gotten absorbed in the overall gridlock about should we expand background checks to try to make sure people who are on terrorist watch lists aren't allowed to purchase firearms, for instance. The National Rifle Association in a different generation, back in the late 80s, early 90s, experimented a little bit with reaching compromises on firearms policy. They felt like they got burned by that because you had even further right, more strident pro-gun groups forming and drawing members away from them. The lesson they learned was there's no gain for us from compromise. And the National Rifle Association's support is pretty important, especially for Republicans in primary elections. And as districts, something I didn't talk about in detail, but it's an important element in understanding the current political context. Members of Congress often represent relatively safe districts from a general election standpoint. The district is drawn to primarily contain Democrats or Republicans. And so a crucial fear is that one will get primary, that one will get described by a primary opponent as a rhino, a Republican in name only, or a dino, a Democrat in name only, and you'll get run out of office by the more radical elements of your party coalition. And this is a real fear. It happens. When I was an undergrad, from Pennsylvania originally, I did an internship with Senator Arlen Specter, a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania at that time. Specter had the distinction of being primary. This is a verb to describe this process of being defeated in the primaries twice in the same electoral cycle. He switched parties to the Democratic Party in 2009 after it became clear that he would probably be defeated in the Republican primary by a candidate running to the right of Specter. He switched to the Democratic Party and then got defeated in the Democratic primary. And so Specter got primaried twice. And so members of Congress, even from a relatively safe seat, are running scared not just of a general election challenge, but of a primary election challenge. And so this makes it very difficult for even a member of Congress on, say, the Republican side who sees some value in various kinds of background check to actually do anything in favor of those, because you're going to have the NRA coming down on you, and that's going to add fuel to a primary challenge from someone who says this person's just trying to take away our guns, and it feeds into the broader process of political polarization that we see currently. So I've wandered a little bit from the basic Second Amendment question, which what's going on with the Second Amendment. I think we see this tug of war over the degree to which we'll have regulations of gun ownership. And the Supreme Court delivered a major win for the pro-gun side a few years ago, and we're still navigating the boundaries of what kinds of regulations are going to be put in place in the wake of that. Yes.
Well, I changed my question.
Okay.
For a few years when I was working in Florida, I was the state manager for a company in Tallahassee. And the gun just came up there. And the NRA, as you say, had a lot of pressure. They were voted down at that time, and the ruckus that was raised in the state capitol over that, and the promise of whose heads would roll in the next election, were less than desirable here. It has always tainted my position on NRA because of that. But with the amount of deaths that have occurred in the last 12 to 18 months in various places, I don't think we have a chance of limiting firearms in states.
Oh, we have enormous numbers of firearms.
Thank you.
But there are enormous numbers of firearms in the United States. There've been some interesting shifts in firearm ownership over time. We're seeing more concentration in firearm ownership. So there are fewer households overall with firearms, but those households that have firearms have large collections often. And but in general, the point is there are lots and lots of guns in American society, and I think I don't see any proposals from I haven't seen any proposals from either presidential candidate that will significantly change that basic pattern. I think we'll still have enormous stockpiles of firearms and lots of guns. And for good and ill, right? We have a raucous political debate about this, but the prospects of any real change on it, I think, are small, as on many issues, in part because of the kind of gridlock we see.
Well, I come from primarily a Quaker heritage. And for the first time in my life, I'm saying, should I buy this? Because I would not want my wife to walk down any street, and I don't mean Portsmouth, anywhere, after dark, by herself. And I think that's an unhealthy way to look at life, but I don't know how we're going to change it.
Yeah, I think we face large systemic challenges as a society that are going to be difficult to solve. And public safety and justice, right? We see this is one of the issues that has gotten drawn into the current presidential campaign, but these are hard issues to resolve, and we have a lot of violence going on. We have challenges in various areas with the police maintaining the respect of groups that they are serving to protect, and then that just magnifies crime challenges sometimes. It's a very, very challenging situation. Now, the level of public safety concern arguably is still relative. Maybe we're in the beginning of a resurgence in crime, but we're still at relatively low levels in most places compared to where they were 25 years ago. The number of murders is nationally way off the peak in the early 90s. Nonetheless, the trajectory in the last year or two has not been in the right direction. So that's troubling, and we'll see where things go from here.
I just, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, there's a saying that says all politics is local. So therefore, are we talking about the fact that change only starts in the community? It appears to me, and we talked a little bit, we were talking about politics at the level of presidential and politics at the level at community level.
Yeah.
And I heard Sue talk about, what was the question that you just said about going to look at the public platforms? Because sometimes I'm concerned about the people who are at the local level and the level to which each individual has to be involved in a way that we need to understand what their platform is. Because oftentimes I think that many things get done at the local level, and we don't seem to see it because we know those people and we like those people. They were our friends and our grandparents or whatever, but sometimes it's not good for people.
That's a brilliant point, and I think it's one of the. I've got a paper that
colleague of mine, I know you and I presented at a conference in early September that that looks at this in the context of state legislatures. One of the things that's happened as our national politics is polarized is that it's become much more, people have become inclined, I'm a Republican at the national level, Democrat at the national level, you vote that way. All the way down ticket. And sometimes that makes sense, but other times that doesn't. Because the local and the state parties aren't necessarily at all the same as the national parties. Remember that graph I put up of the different state parties, right? Different states have very different average legislators from the Republican side or Democratic side, right? There are states where the average Republican is about the same place as the average Democrat in other states, right? Kentucky versus Connecticut, you've got very different Republican parties. The Republican Party in Connecticut is way far right. The Republican Party in Connecticut is very moderate. And so because people are focused on the national level and tar their local legislator and so forth with that brush all too often, it's gotten more and more challenging for the state parties and local politicians to develop a distinctive identity and to make things competitive. And so the risk is we end up with only a few states where there's and few localities where there's actually competition. I think competition is a really important part of democracy in terms of holding people accountable. But if you have, Connecticut, for example, if you look at the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, you try to estimate where the voters are are actually closer to the Republican Party than the Democratic Party in Connecticut. Last time the Republican Party won a majority in the Connecticut legislature was in the 80s, right? And so they've been governed by Democrats for decades. Perhaps because, nationally, if you look at the national parties and the national party position, people in Connecticut are closer to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, so they vote for Democrat. That makes sense at the national level, arguably. Doesn't make sense at the state level, maybe not so much. And so when that kind of thing happens, our local and our state democracies suffer. There's less competition, and there's more opportunity for the state parties to really push policy too far one direction or another without the kind of checks that competition and the benefits that competition provides in terms of having the state or local government be run more effectively. And so there's I think an important challenge is for us to not get fixated, though I've been fixated on that this talk, I admit, not get fixated on that national picture and lose track of our state and local democratic decision-making processes where the choices and the positions are often not quite the same as those at the national level. And we don't pay attention, and the media makes it harder to pay attention because coverage of state politics has gone way down over time. Right? The Virginia Pilot used to have several reporters in Richmond covering the General Assembly. I don't think they have much coverage of the General Assembly now. Maybe they have one person part-time up there now, where they used to have 4.
That was my biggest concern because I moved here from New York, and I know there's an election coming up, and I'm concerned about the one local one. But I haven't seen what these people stand for. I mean, I wasn't raised here. Some of these people know people, but it appears to me that I don't know what, and I'm here and I'm saying this is crazy that nobody really campaigns or really says where the city's going.
Yeah, Portsmouth has a very challenging times in Portsmouth overall.
We say it, but we don't get, and I can't say people aren't talking about it, but the point is that it just appears that folks are just kind of going along with it, and it could be a great city. And I think it's locally, and I hear people say, well, we have no money, but I go to other places when I visit and go do my work, small places where there's such wonderful things happening in small towns. And it has a lot to do with leadership, and I'm not sure that we're doing what we need to do.
Yeah, and
to look at leadership.
I think one of the challenges in getting democratic government to work is the challenge of overcoming the incentives all of us as individuals have to shirk sometimes on the hard work of really figuring out what the best choices are. And yet if nobody does it, we can end up with a set of choices and a set of outcomes that are really not what we would have wished for.
Don't you think we have to really be in the ditch before the energy, or the lack of energy that people do with politics? It's almost, well, we can use Portsmouth or we can use the national. It makes a little difference. It has to get in bad shape before people get up and really show any interest.
I hope we don't have to go there. There is, and there's always been, to a degree. But I think there's a real risk to things getting that bad, because I think we see some aspects of that in the current election cycle. Where people will go when they get sufficiently fed up about how badly their country is being run isn't always to the best place. And it's difficult to, we've got a set of choices at the presidential level, both of which are unpopular, right? There's no, and we're going to have to choose one of them as a country. And I'm not sure I believe there's a sort of, Hegel had some foolish ideas, I think, about history in terms of thinking about kind of cycles of history, and there'd be, you have a crisis and something, sometimes you have a crisis and then you make things worse. There's no guarantee that a crisis will solve problems. Maybe it will. On the other hand, maybe it will simply make exacerbate challenges. I think we have a series of challenges as a country, and what we need to work to do is to strengthen our capacity for democratic self-government in the face of those, and hopefully that will help address the challenges. And that means at all levels, trying to evaluate the plans, the character, the capacity, and the seriousness of our candidates, and are their ideas going to move the country in the right direction or run it further into challenging times? We're in a really, I haven't talked much about the international situation, but internationally we're in a very increasingly dangerous world situation. We've had a period since the end of the Cold War of U.S. hegemony internationally. That is clearly drawing towards a close with challenges from Russia, from China, from various other groups. And we're entering more of a multipolar world. Bipolar worlds can be relatively stable. Multipolar worlds, I think, have a tendency to be much less so. And so we've got challenging times internationally ahead as well. And being the largest in a multipolar world can sometimes be the most dangerous place to be. There's an interesting game theoretic literature on what are known as truels, three-way duels. And depending on the particular alignment of strength, the strongest individual in the duel, the one who's the best shot, has the lowest odds of surviving the duel because everybody else has an incentive to shoot at them. And things can get challenging. All right, well, I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Dr. Richmond, and everybody else. Thank you for coming. And this is where we're going to hold our second Tuesday forums pretty much from now on. Please look at your flyer, and you'll see that the next one is going to be on the Liberty ship. It's going to be presented by Duff Porter. He and another gentleman who shall remain nameless have been working on this ship for quite some time and are very, very knowledgeable about the subject, and I'm hoping that you will come and bring some more friends. Our best publicity is always the word of mouth, so if anybody needs any extra flyers to take back with them, please help yourself. We hadn't decided what we were going to do about eating, whether or not people wanted to have us order something and have Jimmy John's deliver it. So keep that in the back of your mind. Otherwise, you know that there's quite a few very good restaurants in the nearby neighborhoods that you can go and have a good lunch either before or after. And thank you again, Dr. Richmond. I hope that maybe a few people got a few pointers that will help them out and at least provide some clarity. Thank you so much for coming.